Obviously fast moving, Paul, as you mentioned there. Now we have this new imposition of an extra 25% on Indian goods. So obviously, on the one hand, there's the economic impact of this, the trade impact from this in terms of flow of merchandise goods between both nations. But really, probably the bigger story here is just a geopolitical one, what it means for relations between India and the US. Of course, building an alliance with India, building up that Quad infrastructure has been a priority for the US government over the last several years. This would now appear to at least put significant tension into that relationship. We'll have to see exactly how India will want to respond. They are probably unlikely to want to switch off its source of energy from Russia, for example. But I think there's a lot of scrutiny on, yes, on the one hand, it's part of the tariff blitz, and you have to question what will this mean for the cost of goods and what will it mean for both economies. But the bigger story, I think, is what will it mean for relations between both governments, obviously at a very pivotal time in the geoeconomic space, and whether or not there can be an off-ramp on this in the near term. But I think those are the real questions people are asking.
You said tariff blitz, and I think we're definitely seeing that. We have the president of Switzerland making her dash to Washington on Tuesday in a last-minute attempt to really prevent the U.S. from imposing higher tariffs. What is the latest on that? And if you could just tie everything together from India to Switzerland and even China, what is the latest that we should be expecting?
Well, I guess, look, clearly we're at the business end of President Trump's hawkish trade agenda now, Isabel. He's keen to get some of these measures across the line. With Switzerland, as you mentioned, the president has arrived in DC. She hasn't arrived here with a formal invitation. A lot of people are making that observation. She's here for some whatever talks she can get, including with the Secretary of State, Rubio. The thinking is there will be a focus on tariffs around agricultural goods, gold, pharmaceuticals. Where can concessions be made? Where can Switzerland meet the US halfway to try and get this 39% level down? But as I say, not clear where those talks will go, given that it's not an official invite from the top principals. But to your broader point, no doubt about it, we're seeing now this flurry of moves. India today, the Swiss talks are underway. President Trump has threatened more to come on the pharmaceutical front quite soon. That will be an important one to watch. And of course, the China talks ongoing. Now, all of this just continues to add to the idea of a very hawkish trade policy. We don't yet know where it's all going to land, because these talks on several fronts are ongoing. But at the very least, you'd have to say clearly tariffs are rising, tariffs are here to stay, and that whatever comes out of the weeks ahead really is going to be a question of what level those tariffs will be set more than anything else.
And there seems to be a theme emerging that if you write a check big enough for the U.S. government, for this administration, whether you are a university, whether you are an individual company, and we'll see that from Apple this afternoon, or whether you're actually a country, that can buy you some goodwill, in this case, lower tariffs. Is that kind of how a lot of folks are thinking about this transactional president?
Well, clearly there's been a bilateral focus, no doubt about it, Paul, when it comes to the trade deals. Individual countries have been coming to the US saying, look, what can we do here? Promising more investment, promising to buy more goods or shake up their own tariffs, like you mentioned. So there clearly is a transactional side to it. And then, of course, at the corporate level, like you mentioned, big companies have been touting big figures of capex investment into the US. President Trump and his team, of course, touting those figures as signs of what their trade policy is achieving. There is skepticism, of course, when it comes to capex and investment announcements by companies in terms of what's new, what's old money, what's fresh money, so to speak. But nonetheless, the figures are big, and the administration is touting it. And it does speak to the idea that President Trump goes out there with a big hawkish take. He puts some big figures on the table, and companies and countries are responding. And that does seem to be where we're at right now in terms of where this overall trade policy is headed.
To Paul's point, apart from writing a big check, what tactics are you seeing to be proving as effective when it comes to these countries? Because I feel like some countries, it's just done and smooth is better, but for some, you see it a little bit more drawn out and a little bit more in our headlines.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think some countries, Isabel, are just avoiding retaliation. They're just playing the Trump game. They're coming to the table. They're saying, okay, you're making these demands. What can we do? I mean, the EU was interesting. They had threatened all kinds of retaliation over the past few months on individual products and on broader measures and on investment flows and the like. But ultimately, that deal was done with 15%. That once upon a time would have been quite a shock, the US putting 15% on EU goods. Other trading partners, similar, playing that kind of waiting game, not necessarily responding with retaliation. But of course, like you say, there's underlying tensions in other relationships that are much harder to resolve. The most obvious one being China, of course. Those talks continuing, tariffs still remaining in those 40s, 50% effective average rate area. And of course, you're seeing the underlying tensions now with India as well. So on the one hand, some countries coming to the table to try and get a deal done and to move on. Others much more protracted and complex, like you mentioned.